Hello and welcome to Deep in the D-Pad, where we explore all things gaming through an intellectual lens. I'm your friendly neighborhood host and game designer, Carlos, and with me, as always, is R.K. Taylor.
Hello.
Today we're going to be talking about development cycles and just, I guess, answering all the questions Ryan has about them. And we're going to take you on that magical journey and hopefully teach you a thing or two as well. Maybe we'll share a laugh, who knows. Before we get there, we need to have a couple of D-pad delights.
I really want to tell you about an experience that I had. This is different than the D-pad delight I was planning to share, but
Right.
Just joking about there being an air horn reminded me of something that's gaming related, I guess. I went to bar trivia, like for the first time in my life. Pretty sure
Bar
it's the first
trivia,
time.
like you went out to a social drinking hole and people asked you questions, and as a team you filled out a piece of paper that answered those questions, that type of bar trivia?
Oh yeah, and
Okay.
this is post-COVID, so this is like Ryan 5.0 or something. I don't even know what the last update
Dude,
was.
I've already seen your telekinesis. Like, I don't need to know tell me you're vaccinated without telling me you're vaccinated, okay? God. All right. I got super speed. I'm happy with what I got. You got telekinesis. Let's just all be blessed here.
Anyway, so I went to bar trivia, and the person who was running the trivia was ancient and had no charisma whatsoever. Very, very low energy. She explained the rules so many times. It was only
Was
bearable.
it like Ben Stein? Was it like the Bueller?
Yeah, exactly.
Bueller?
It was only bearable because of how hilarious it was and how, like, I think that anybody who walked in, regardless of whether they knew it was trivia or not, is less likely to go back to that particular trivia place. Like, it's the opposite of, like, a good commercial. You know, it's bad marketing to have your trivia person be really dry. But the only thing that got me through it was just laughing about how tough it was to endure. You know, talk about first world problem, you know? But you know, I love questions, I love games, I love learning, so
Right.
I'm here for the trivia.
This
But
was a
at
game
one
out in the
point,
wild, yes.
for my D-pad delight, you know, with all this backstory, one thing that she did was accidentally play an air horn. Like there was a between songs, she pressed the air horn, and then everybody at my table was just like, oh, okay, you know, it's like, yeah, well, she knows how to jam, and then she says, oh, I'm sorry, that was an accident, and I'm like, that is the only key on your keyboard that is not an accident. Everything else today was an accident, but it just was so funny to me because of how often we would joke about the air horn when we were during our DJ Hero days.
Yeah,
you know, like that. We thought being a DJ was using the air horn. You know,
that was the magic. It was pressing colored buttons and then using a lot of fucking air horn, dude. Like, that's all you needed.
Well-timed
Although,
air
to
horn.
be fair, back then, like, it was air horn and what? I don't want to say. It's kind of like whatever the fucking. Yeah, that and like whatever the sound in grinding is, like the like boom, 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 like fucking just really aggressive, like bassy bullshit that causes my recording volume to modulate itself.
We got third. I think we got third place, and they gave us a $10 coupon.
Ooh,
but I really don't think
you could probably buy an air horn with a $10 coupon.
Oh man, or not $10 gift certificate, not coupon. How terrible would it be if you got it just a coupon? It's like, yeah, third place, sorry y'all.
Come back, buy
10% off.
some. Yeah, come back, buy some 10% off booze and try again. So for my D-pad delight, it has to do with a lot more indoor stuff and way more single player stuff. Back when I first got the Nintendo 64, I vaguely remember as like a small child going into Toys R Us and seeing the big N64 box with like the yellow panel, the red panel, the black front panel that had the image of the console on it. And then I got Mario 64 and Star Wars Shadows of the Empire, which, like, Mario probably very much in line with what I could actually play at the time. Star Wars, way too complex for what my little, like, baby brain could, like, understand then. And even then, like, Mario, I can only understand as much as, like, this is a sandbox, whatever, I could jump around in. What actually ended up creating, like, a very sticking memory in my head for so long is playing the Battle of Hoth in Shadows of the Empire. It was like a very early like wow moment for me, I guess, in gaming. It's the scene from the Star Wars movies where they're on the ice planet. There are these big elephant-like robots like walking across the tundra, and then Luke and other heroes are flying around in these like little, almost like paper airplane looking like gray flying crafts. And anyway, they're flying around, they're shooting lasers, and they're deploying these like lassos to wrap around the legs of the big elephants to trip them and stuff. And they were able to like make this in the N64 game. It was like the start of 3D gaming. They were like, hey, look at these models, you know, they're small in the distance, but when you fly up close to them, you only see the legs. Like, that's how big they are, and all this other cool stuff. And just like, at the time, it felt like the level was just like massive. Like, I don't recall ever really bumping into the edges or something. And it was just like such a wow moment, both in like, I guess kind of like the scale of like showing like what's possible, showing off scale itself with like the elephant things, and just being like fantasy fulfillment, like, oh, like I'm a little kid, I fucking love Star Wars, the Phantom Menace hasn't come out yet, like I don't know what fucking like capitalist manipulation of nostalgia is, I just know I'm in Hoth and I'm like flying and everything's great. And then I would just do that and I'd fucking die and I wouldn't care because I could fly around Hoth all over again. And that was just awesome, man. I don't really have much more to say on it. I just really liked playing that level, and it sticks with me.
I like the scale thing. That's my favorite part.
Yeah, man.
Seeing something far away and then, like, you know, realizing it's the same. It reminds me of the, do you know the fable about the elephants?
No.
Okay. Is it cool if I take this detour really quick?
Let's go down a D-pad detour.
Ooh, oh my gosh, I love that, yo. Quick, trademark. Get my IP lawyer. There's like this there's this parable of the elephant, and it, you know, I don't remember every part of this, right? So like bear with me. I learned this in the context of like religious pluralism, which is basically the idea that we were discussing was like perhaps all religions kind of mean the same thing and they're glimpsing at the transcendent in a different way. So the way that this is depicted with the elephant fable is like there are let's say like 6 blind men, right? And they are all around an elephant and they're touching different parts of the elephant. So someone touches the tail and they think it's a snake, and another person grabs a leg and they think it's a tree trunk. And someone touches an ear and they think it's like, you know, a big leaf or something. I don't know. I don't remember what all the parts represent, but that's not the point. The idea is that like they're all wrong, but they're all kind of right too. So rather than, you know, the idea connecting this to like philosophy of religion is that anytime someone is experiencing something that they believe to be like metaphysical or spiritual, perhaps that is part of the elephant. And, you know, the collective consciousness, if we could all perceive all of these spiritual dimensions simultaneously, we would understand it to be an elephant. But, you know, with our like mere human senses, we only understand the parts of the divine.
The thing I sort of draw from it is kind of like the shared communication of it all. Shared interpretation, I guess I should say, is like, you know, we're all looking at the same thing. We're blind, but we're all grabbing at the same thing and we're trying to communicate that it is in fact the same thing, but we're not using the same words. Like, because of, you know, whatever reason, whether we're touching like a different part or we don't know how to communicate what that part is, like we're not sharing the same vision because of that like miscommunication. And that's all I got to say on that.
And now let's get deeper into the D-pad.
Where do we want to start with this, Ryan? You have a lot of questions about like the development cycle. Like, should I just kind of start from where I think the top is, or like kind of talk about the general, like, you know, making a game takes like making a concept and like, you know, making a prototype and then things. I don't know. What question you got, dude?
Yeah, I guess I'm curious what precedes the concept phase, if anything. It seems to me like that would have to be the kind of initial starting point, but I'm curious if there's like production stuff that I'm like not familiar with that has to be considered prior to just everybody like brainstorming, basically?
That's a real good question to start with. So I would say most of the time I'm going to be talking from a like business studio standpoint. And I'll like call out when I'm more so talking about like a hobbyist or, someone that isn't necessarily trying to like acquire money in some way for their game
more indie
effort. Yeah. Well, indie could even in some way, in a lot of ways, indies is like still trying to make money off their thing. Whereas a hobbyist is like just doing it. But anyway, to go to the very start, right? If a business is like, hey, we don't have anything on our docket, like we want to make a game, the studio asks itself like, well, do you want to make your own game that's like original? Is someone going to pay you for that? Or do you have to go find funding to do that? And then if you got to go find funding, are you able to really make your own game? Or do you have to like work with somebody who wants a game made, like kind of like contract mercenary work or something like that? So those are a couple of the avenues that like a developer can go down in the very early stages. We'll call this like the searching stage, right? Where a business is looking for contracts like, hey, maybe Wizards of the Coast wants a Might and Magic game. I don't know if they own that IP. Maybe I'm thinking Magic the Gathering. Anyway, these people, they have a license. Let's say Wanted, the movie, right? The Wanted license holders, Fox, they want a game to come out alongside Wanted. Oh, hey, here's a developer called Grin. They're willing to make a game for us if we're willing to pay them to make said game. And maybe we'll pay them a little bit extra if the game performs well. Like we'll add that into the contract, something like that. And so that's kind of like the more contract hunting part. If you guys, as a studio, are trying to make something like super, like wholly original and potentially even self-funded / published, it's going to be more so like talking to all parts of the studio, like the development team. So like, technology wise, what do we want to do, artistically, what do we want to do? Where do we want to go? Gameplay wise, like what fun new ideas do we want to explore? And
that's the concept phase, right?
That is not necessarily a concept phase just yet. It's more so, I guess, like reaching out. Okay, so maybe I kind of like worded it wrong there.
Can I try to say? Okay, it sounds like what you're saying is that for existing IPs, there's an additional step that precedes the brainstorming phase, which is, can we get this okayed? And then from there,
yes.
So okay, so I guess we don't need to call that anything, but like basically, it's like the shaking hands. It has to happen before the brainstorming. Right,
yeah. So at the very like top level or at the earliest phase, it has to be like, okay, you're allowed to work on the Wanted game. And they know like you're going to make a shooting game. It might not even be decided that you want to make a first person or a third person shooting game. It's just decided that we think it's going to be best and most fun if we can make a Wanted game that is a shooter that maybe has a bit of adventure to it. And who knows, maybe it was pitched for like a multiplayer mode or something additional, and that's it, like very, very high level at a glance things. And then the IP holders would be like, okay, a Wanted game, like that property makes sense with shooting, and we know that the shooting genre makes a fair amount of money, so this seems like a decent investment, 2 + 2, so we'll shake hands on it. And then when they shake hands on it, we can then go to the concept phase, which then is, hey, we have a box. We need to make a Wanted game. It needs to be within the Wanted universe. It needs to use some of the mechanics from Wanted. We know there's curving the bullet, so we absolutely got to use that. That's like the core of the movie. So we should probably make that the core of our game, and then go on from there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you kind of go on from there, and some studios and some IP holders have like looser or tighter relationships with the other party or their IP. So you kind of just go into talking it out amongst yourselves in like these various team formations, what ideas and things you want to explore and or bring to life in this box that has been presented to you. So like, oh, we're in the Wanted game. Do we have to be a direct one-to-one to the movie? And if the IP holder says, no, like you could just be in the Wanted universe, tell us what you're thinking, it then kind of opens up the gates of like, oh, well, it would be really cool if it was a prequel story where I actually played the dude's dad because, you know, the movie's all about the dad, but what if the game or the movie is all about the son trying to chase after the dad? But what if the game was about the dad leading up to the events that, you know, happened right before the movie? And there are times where you get that type of wiggle room and other times where they say, no, maybe we want more of a one-to-one thing, or just the idea you have isn't really in alignment with what we think the IP is. And there's just a lot of that type of stuff. But that's more of like the studio talking with the IP holder. When the studio talks to itself, meaning like the teams are brainstorming and figuring out, like, let's say the narrative team, they're focused on like story and how it's delivered in the game. Those could be two different teams internally as well. Like one team is actually writing and crafting the story beats and figuring out like what boundaries they can push to make a really cool story within the Wanted universe. And the narrative like implementation team or the narrative design team, whatever they would be called, is more focused about, okay, how do we get these beats to actually execute well in the game engine? Like, do we need a camera that doesn't like break, doesn't transition, or like a one take camera basically, or can we set up like this type of like sliding camera system that sort of cuts between certain ones, and do we need loading screens, that type of thing? Or like, hey, with pickups, like, here's a text collectible. No text collectible should be longer than like 15 seconds to read. That might be a general rule that comes out of that team during the concept phase. Whereas like level design could be saying, wow, this Wanted game sounds so cool. We could be globe-trotting. I think that makes sense for linear levels, not necessarily open world, especially with the curve the bullet thing. Let's make it a cover-based shooter because, you know, cover shooters are really big. Gears of War is out and Army of Two and what else ever. And no game allows you to circumvent cover, but Wanted really does. And that's where more things flourish and so on and so forth. So that is the concept, like the texts, writing out these like documents, or rather just brainstorming and stuff. And eventually it turns into writing out documents and like figuring out all these different pieces.
Okay. So it sounds like there's a lot of, for licensed properties, there's a lot of approval that needs to be done because to some degree the original IP is like canonizing what the studio is developing, right? Like they're determining that like, well, if this was a prequel and, you know, then we have to, any future sequels that they have, if they want them to be in alignment, you know, if they don't want to have a discohering, you know, narrative across their different properties, then...
Exactly, yeah. It is very much like, hey, we have a lore, we have rules established, right? Like, if you're going to make a Simpsons game, that's like kind of a little looser, but to some extent, if you're going to make a Simpsons game, like, you need to acknowledge, like, certain characters do certain things, other characters would never do a certain thing, like that type of thing.
Okay, so can we run with the rest of this cycle without using licensed properties?
Totally.
Because, okay, cool. So what happens after concept?
So let's say you're doing just an original game, right? You didn't do any of that licensing stuff. You were like, hey, here's our original idea. Like, we want to explore this gameplay and we want to explore this narrative in this world. And now everybody is kind of like on this same page of the big picture of what we want to do. Then you get into a pre-production greenlight phase, which is where you're making prototypes of the things, the features, the top level stuff that you're proposing. So not necessarily right off the bat trying to make a prototype of your whole game, right? It's not like you have to, as soon as pre-production starts, make like the AI working in combat against other AI and then have a cinematic system, yada yada. Like all of that stuff goes in like phases and different tiers. And part of that kind of relates to, I guess, the game engines episode, in that like you need pre-production to build out parts of the engine, whether it be like a content editor of some sort, or like new tools for the artists, new tools for other designers. All that stuff on top of the gameplay itself is like what is kind of happening in pre-production and leading up to greenlight, which if we were to take a rough example, like let's say like Dead Space, like that's pretty hot in the news recently, so that's what I'm just thinking of at the moment. Dead Space had like 13 levels or whatever, for instance. Let's say it took them in pre-production / greenlight, it took them like 18 months to make one level. If they get to that greenlight and they make that one level and everyone's like, whoa, this is fucking amazing, they now have 18 months to make 12 more levels. Because the hope and the idea is through pre-production and greenlight, you build out all the features you need leading up to building out a demo of what the game could and should be, if not better. And then if they say, yeah, this is good, you already have the tools it takes and you've figured out a process to make that content. And you can then use that to make the rest of the game. And from there, if you have like a sequel, it just keeps building on that. Well, there's a lot more after the green light that we'll get into, but just saying, when all is said and done, like when you have a game, like most likely in the modern era, you can go back to that project and like build upon it to make the sequel.
Right. The green lighting and the pre-production stuff that you were just talking about kind of reminds me of like a television pilot. You know, It's like you need to have a self-contained episode and that needs to be pitched. And if it's approved, then you can be approved to, make the whole season. But once you've done that, once you've done the pilot, you already know who your cast is. So that's one less thing. You don't have to go through the months of selecting a cast.
Yeah, it's really good you mentioned the Hollywood side of it, because like I think for the most part, like game development is some synthesis of the software development cycle, just like any sort of software, say Microsoft Word, what have you, and the film production cycle. Like I haven't read into either of them too deeply, but they both definitely have influenced the creation and the development of the development cycle.
Right, because they are like a Silicon Valley industry, but also an entertainment industry.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so what happens after it's greenlit?
Shit starts to get real after it's greenlit. Actually, the whole development cycle, more or less, is a like wartime bombing run. You're going to take a really big plane filled with really big explosive cargo, and you're going to fly it as best as you can to hit a certain point. And most likely something is going to go wrong, and you're not going to hit that exact point, and you got to do your best to try and hit that point.
So you're telling me that you can't think of an analogy that doesn't involve killing civilians?
I didn't say we had to drop it on anyone. It could have been a test ground. Are you kidding? Wow, Ryan. So you're the one thinking of death here. I'm just thinking of a simple plane. A simple plane that just carries heavy cargo. Now, where that makes sense, right? Where it starts to, connect to game development is during, let's just take a small step back to when I was talking about like searching for contracts and shit. In a way, that's like figuring out what hangar you want to like work with, maybe what plane model you're going to want to build before going on your run, right? And then the concept phase, you're now like, okay, I got my kind of base. I got the frame of my plane. Now I need to figure out like what paneling I'm going to put on it and what decals I want on it and what like cool engines I want or cool modifications on my plane. Like I don't have that yet. I'm just drawing all that out. And then in the pre-production greenlight, that's when you start kind of like slapdashing shit onto the plane to kind of build it out and visualize it so that a flight engineer can come up and be like, damn, this looks like shit. But I can make one just as good, if not better, in like a couple of months. Just give me some time. And like they'll give you the tools to make it even better. That is, so that's like your kind of pre-production green light thing. And now you're on production. Like you have got your plane, like the flight engineer came back, you got your plane, and now you're going to have to start like loading cargo into it and putting like some touches on it before it takes off. And that brings me to like alpha.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, what is alpha?
Alpha is when you have implemented most, if not all, your core stuff for the game. Like, I'm talking like core stuff. Let's just say, it's a linear first-person shooter with like very simple AI. At alpha, you would want 2 levels to be able to load back to back, right? Like you finish a level and then it loads you into another level to prove that you have a level-based system. You'd want a first-person camera with like proper moving and proper shooting. Those are like 2 different features, 3 different features, honestly, because the camera itself is one. And you would want like the AI in there. Maybe it doesn't need to move around at alpha, but the AI definitely needs to be like present and somewhat accounted for. And then just having in like the roadmap for the big stuff that you're putting in very soon, and even having like placeholder in for stuff is really good at that phase. That is alpha. That is like, all right, we just did takeoff, like we were cleared to go, and we just did the takeoff. Now we're up in the air, and at that point, you as developer are working on the game. Let's say me as a like level designer, I may not have the AI that's like super smart and compelling to play against yet, so I need to like build my levels to kind of like guesstimate how good the AI is going to be and know like what parts they're going to use to like, make that content decent. In doing that, we figure out like where the fun is in some cases. Like, as you prove things out and as you test things, you find out some things aren't necessarily that fun. Other things are way more fun than you expected. So since you're so early in your flight path and you're up in the air, and in development, you can shift your course. You can say, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take Wanted again for an example, but you say like, oh shit, curving the bullet is so much more fun than we could have imagined. Let's make like some challenge levels, like some puzzle levels that require you to curve the bullet. And someone would say like, wait, we never agreed to make puzzle levels, but then they play it and they feel the same thing and they're like, oh shit, we got to change course. Like turn the plane 2 degrees to the right. We're doing these puzzle levels because that's going to give us a bigger impact at the end.
You love your plane metaphor. You're like,
it's really good.
You just want to play Microsoft Flight Simulator all day. It sounds like after pre-production, that's when there starts to be like real like boots on the ground kind of development and playing and experimentation. Mm-hmm. Once things have been greenlit, you have a working model, you're able to like alter that original idea in order to like serve the game itself. Is that basically right?
Yeah, so the original idea is going to stay there and it's going to stay mostly consistent, but there's a lot of stuff around that idea that you could massage and manipulate to greatly affect the end product. And when you are past that green light phase, when you are, let's say from day 0 is like after green light to alpha, you are going to start breaking out into content teams, because the hope is that you will have those tools to make more levels, right? It took you 18 months to make 1 level. Now you should be able to break out into these like diverse teams of people, like for instance, you'd have like team on level 1 would be like an artist, a programmer, a level designer, a technical designer, narrative designer, whoever else is needed. But generally you want to keep the group kind of small, strike team sized, because otherwise it gets like too many cooks and you could get to a lot of kind of just like decision locked moments, bottlenecking, if you will. So you all are getting into your little like pit crew teams, and you're working on your specific piece of content to bring it up to alpha quality. And if every team is doing what they need to do, then auto-magically all the levels, or however many levels are necessary, become alpha quality at the alpha time or just before the alpha time. And when you're getting to reaching these milestones, you're doing these like hardening phases, like 2 months or 1 month, however long leading up to the milestone. And the hardening means you're like bug testing it, stability testing it, making sure like, hey, the stuff we're contractually required to put in the game, that's in the game. And also it doesn't break. Like this much stuff is playable. That's what we agreed upon.
Okay, so there's a certain standard that everyone has to uphold. So everybody by July 21st is going to have to reach like alpha build, right? Something
yeah,
like
the
that.
production team would keep eyes and inform the team of like what needs to be done at what rate in order to reach like the agreed upon terms. And that could be like, hey, we got to hit alpha by this date, you guys need to make these features, tell us how much time and or what are the steps it takes to make these, and those kind of break into what we call Jira tickets. Jira is a bug tracking software that is widely used. There are other models as well out there, but those get all broken up into these little like tasks that get time estimates, and then we can then start taking them down like post-it notes, like, oh, okay, I'm working on this today, I'm working on that today, and then 6 months later the level is done and playable and looks good.
Okay, so tell me about beta.
So when we're going from alpha to beta, it's basically including more. Like the process of alpha to beta is really just about getting all of your game into the game in at least a placeholder form. And that is to show we have like committed to all this work. We have made it in a state that like it can go into the game, or we have at least implemented the framework to support this stuff, because kind of, again, going back to our game engines conversation, right? You need the framework in order to put the game on top of it. So we need to show that if we don't have cinematics actually playing, we need to show that there's a system that can take a cinematic file, display it on the screen, and then disappear it and like play the game afterwards. And that proves in a beta format that you have that feature. Most of the core stuff you'd hope to have in a visually close to final state, meaning like if you have shooting as your main mechanic, or like a puzzle game thing as your main mechanic, your very core mechanics should be working well. They shouldn't necessarily be crashing the game. They shouldn't be feeling undercooked or anything like that. But again, they're also like not super final. You're going to be balancing things like how the impact of guns feel, through damage and or visual feedback and stuff like that. And at this point in beta, QA is not only present throughout this like start of production process, meaning I imagine somewhere through some amount of pre-production / greenlight, QA is present, but they're not necessarily like ramped up with more employees and going at full force. When things get to like alpha and certainly beta, the QA team is expanding and a lot of new faces are showing up. Or if QA is done off-site, you're not seeing new faces. You're just seeing new comments. And they play the builds, it's like, oh, hey, we need to do a hardening thing. Like I mentioned a few moments ago, we need QA to play this. We need you guys, the content developers, to play this and like break the hell out of it and fix it wherever it breaks. We don't need a leaky airplane here. And just sort of to give a small taste of what like QA has to do, it's mostly like the scientific method while playing video games. And if they run into any issues, such as, oh, I was like walking my character against the invisible wall that protects me from falling off the level, and at some point I fell off the level, they then need to, form hypothesis, test hypothesis, figure out the very specifics of what gets the hypothesis to actually happen, and then present that as a bug report to the developer, so that me as a level designer can see, oh, in level 1 at this corner of the military base and the med bay, there is a hole in the wall on the floor where I can see into the negative zone, and I read that and I go, oh well, fuck, I shouldn't have let that happen. Let me load that level up real quick. I know exactly what he's talking about. And I put in a piece of geometry that like, totally blocks that out and looks appropriate for the level, like it's an additional wall or a locker or something. Anyway, so QA sees that type of stuff. They'll write it up with different bug classes. Like, this is a blocker. It literally stops me from progressing in the game, and I cannot get past it. It's a major bug. It doesn't necessarily block me, but it really fucks up the game. My character model disappears. Like, how am I going to play? I can still walk around. I can still technically play, but, like, this is a major issue. And then you got, like, minor, and then A, B, C, D, that type of thing. So that's beta. Do you have any thoughts or comments, suggestions? I don't know why I said suggestions. I meant more questions on that.
Suggestions. Yeah, be a better developer. Stop putting bugs in your game. I really like that there's bug classifications. I mean, I never thought about that. Like, are you like an entomologist? Like, what's up, man?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about, again, like, trying to communicate as quickly and concisely as possible. So the bug classes really help us out. Oh, and it also really helps for production, right? Like, at some point, production and the development team need to figure out which bugs are worth grabbing and fixing. So I could talk a little bit more on that.
You're talking about like a prioritization, right? Like,
yeah.
You're saying like obviously any game breaking bugs absolutely cannot be in there, so those would have to be the first ones that you would address.
For sure, yeah. And that will come into play more as we talk on like the gold milestone and or the day one patches.
Is gold the next one? Is that after beta? There's no like
yes.
omega or whatever is after beta?
No, we go alpha, beta, gold, and then patches. So let's talk about gold, which is the final, basically. Gold is the version of the game that will get pressed to discs if it's being pressed to disc. Otherwise, it is just the champion, quote unquote, version of the game that is like, this is fully playable and the least buggy, and it's awesome, and you're going to love it. Everything is in and final, right? At this point, in our airplane metaphor, you are not changing course at all. Like beta, by the time you hit beta, you're not changing course. You are fully committed to that course. Beta, if anything, you get like a 1 degree change or something like that. When you're on gold, that is it. You're like 30 seconds out from your very vacant, non-populated target, and you're about to drop the payload. Gold is about to happen. Everything is in final. You're just bug fixing. QA and the development team are all just playing the game as much as they can and trying to figure out like what the bugs are. And what the production team in part is doing is looking at all the bugs we have. There's also people on the QA team, like QA managers and stuff, that can like keep track of the bug database and then present these like charts and tables of, we have this many blocker bugs, we have this many A-class bugs, and this, that, and the third. This is how much time we have left to, dedicate to these bugs. What bugs do we want to dedicate time to? And what bugs do we have to let slip into a day one patch or potentially like not even address? Because there is a classification of bugs called will not fix, which just is flat out like, it's not like a snarky thing. It is we in some cases it might be, but in most cases it's, we simply do not have time or potentially the resources to fix this.
It's more cosmetic though, I would imagine, right? Like they're just like, oh, like this is bleeding through, like when he steps on like in the snow, there aren't enough footprints or something like that, right? Like
that could be a will not fix. Like it depends because yeah, it's just really it all depends. Like somebody could say, if it's something like I'm not jumping high enough, then that's definitely a bug worth looking into. If it is like I literally can't reach the platform. But if somebody is like, I just don't feel like I jumped too high, then that's like more of a will not fix because that's not an actual bug. But to bring it to an actual bug, I guess, you could have something that is like, this has a 10% chance of happening. If the player decides to jump through this window in this building, there is a 10% chance that the level will reload itself or the game will crash. And the game crashing, that makes it like a higher priority thing. But the fact that it's like 10% or lower is what kind of prioritizes it. So like you got to like make these like calls and spin different plates to figure out like, you know, where is this shit going to land?
10% is way too high.
It's definitely way too high. Yes.
Okay,
a
so
10% would not go through.
You intimated that the day one patch is what succeeds the like it going gold. Is that right?
Yeah. So the day one patch is anything that it's anything really high priority that couldn't be hit during gold, and for the most part that is like bug fixes and performance enhancements, like you know, optimization coding and shit like that. So your day one patch isn't going to have like a whole new level, no new cinematics or whatever. Like it may be the matter that someone will have to like repackage the game and export it to do the patch, and that's where you, I believe, sometimes see these major patch file sizes that are like, what, 16 gigs for this patch? Like, what the fuck? It's more likely than not they're like re-exporting like some big chunk of the game, or there was something they updated that had a dependency that was a big chunk of the game that had to be re-exported. So yeah, the day one patch is focused primarily on like anything that's still lingering that's game breaking. Like if you couldn't get that window, because it's 10% and because it's gold and because like, you know we could day one patch, maybe that slips through, but by golly it better be fixed on the day one patch.
The problem with that, of course, is that there's a gamble. It's like, can we actually figure out the solution basically to the problem prior to the first day? Like that, if you've gone gold and you have a release date, there's the firmest deadline you're going to have is the day one patch, right?
No, the firmest deadline, I mean, your project could totally get killed before launch, and we've seen that numerous times. If you don't hit your milestone, there's no sense from a business perspective to like keep funding you, especially if you repeatedly cannot hit milestones.
Wow. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, that's the pressure.
Gotcha. Wow, that's a lot of pressure. The entire cycle. So it's like we said that we would reach alpha by here. We have a duty to do this, like, you know, to uphold for the sake of the
whoever's paying us.
Basically. Yeah. Wow. Oh man, that's
so
scary.
It's very much.
But that's
like,
how these games like Metroid or something like that's been in development for so many years. Like they're expecting there to be such a significant payoff because there's like a diehard following, right?
Yeah.
That, like even if they haven't made alpha when they said that they were going to, or if they had to like start from scratch, they did this with Halo 2, right? Where like people didn't like the Halo trailer, so then they redid Halo 5 basically. Am I remembering that correctly?
I don't remember the Halo story all too much, but the development cycle is totally, it's not like wholly adherent to those deadlines, but it's like 95% adherent to those deadlines, more or less.
Right.
Like
the point I was trying to make is that for like games that they expect to have like a cult following and where the backers of it know that they're going to get a return on investment if they pour more resources into it, they would be more likely to accept missed deadlines because the franchise has been long running, rather than something that's maybe like a smaller or riskier IP.
I think yes and no. It's way more of a case by case thing. Like, yes, you can have a game that goes through what is known as development hell, and you can have games that end up just completely changing like entirely before they come out. Like in a way, maybe the most recent Prey game fits this model, because I don't know if you remember, but back when we were like playing 360, Modern Warfare 2, there was a game called Prey that had come out that was like some sci-fi game about like, I think a Native American dude, and there was like portals in it. Like, I remember it because it was a big selling point that there was portals in it. Like you could, before Portal had come out, I suppose. And then Prey 2 was supposed, I think it had gotten a trailer or something for either Xbox One or 360, and nothing was ever heard from it again until like Arcane Studios suddenly shows off a trailer for this game called Prey on like, at some later point on a later console, and you're like, that's not the Prey I remember. This is an entirely different and original story and stuff. Like, what happened there? That is very much a production cycle that had started, got cut for whatever reason, and that IP ended up, going to a different studio and going on to a different project and a different production cycle. So it's like, it's not necessarily the same game lived on, but it's like, that is a IP that got connected to like 2 projects before actually releasing.
So completely new team. All the people from the original team like ostensibly got laid off. Or
It was several
projects.
years in a different studio, I believe.
Oh my gosh. And the people got laid off probably, or from the original studio, or at least had to switch projects.
At the very least, they had to switch projects. Yeah, I don't remember which studio made the original Prey, if they're defunct or not.
Like that's some dog eat dog stuff right there, man.
Just to show you, just to give you, I mean, you're talking dog eat dog, and just to give you like the last bit to complete that world is like the game could come out too. Like you could hit all your milestones and like, that dev cycle's good and the game comes out and just nobody buys it. And like the studio, depending on the state of the studio, like at that point the studio could go under, or the whoever owns that studio, can say, hey, we're going to try it again, try it with something different. Maybe we're going to continue breathing life into this game. Like it could have very well have been that No Man's Sky, Hello Games could have like shut down, but they trucked on. And let's say there's kind of like this memed image that goes around of like studios that EA and or 2K have closed down because, they were making great games and then they got acquired by like that publisher. And over the course of like 2 to 3 titles, they end up going defunct because of a variety of reasons. That's kind of, just the sort of grim survival of the games entertainment industry, I suppose. The double-edged sword of being under one of the big daddies, meaning like Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, is like you're going to get all the funding you need, most likely, but you're going to be very beholden to whatever vision or portfolio or requirements that they will want to impose.
Right. So getting back to the cycle itself, after the day 1 patch, it's got to be just like other patches, right? It's like other, like if the game's a live service, game is a live service, then we know that there are cosmetics that are added, and if the whatever, if their game,
I like to call those more so like post-release updates, because patches to me really read as, hey, this is a fix. Like you're putting a patch on a hole in the wall or some sort of issue, and that's fixing it. But the things like cosmetics and or new cars in Rocket League or new levels in Rocket League, new game modes, those are content. So like I like to just say post-release updates to encompass content as well as patches. I guess the way I put it, which might be a more cynical kind of take, but I'll maybe say the optimistic one after.
Let's keep them biting, like keep them placated.
It's more so damage or fallout management, right? So like if the day 1 patch comes out and people are still like flipping their shit over whatever they want to, then you mitigate that with post-release updates. So it's like, oh, this game barely has anything to do. What is this, a baby's toy? All right, our post-release update plan is we're going to give the players more content. Oh, I can't. This game is so cumbersome to play. Why don't I have the ping system from Apex Legends? Why don't I have crossplay? Well, shit, I guess our post-release updates are going to focus on patches for crossplay and patches for whatever that guy was fucking complaining about. And that's the whole back and forth of it. Like what do the developers still need to do? What does the publishing house like want, if anything, still? And then what does the player base want? And yeah, that's the post-release update.
Okay, that's a good distinction. I dig that. I also just inhabited a mental world where you were permanently doing them an impression of that guy, like that whoever that is in your head. Like I just imagined that your real voice was that voice. Whew, wow, I'm so glad it's not.
What a world. What a nightmarish world.
Okay, so where are these terms coming from? How long has this cycle been around? I guess eventually I want to get to like, is this useful or is it an obsolete framework? But in terms of like the history of the cycle and stuff, and yeah, is this what you were saying about it being like entertainment related? Is this a similar thing in like the entertainment industry? Is that
Yeah, so where you kind of touched on this earlier, which is great because I talked about how there was kind of like a synthesis of software development, which I think we see with the alpha beta gold and the patching. I think that is very much the like software development cycle showing itself in full force in game development. But things like maybe the IP stuff and the conceptual phase along with the green light, that I see that as being more of the like film side of things, the entertainment production side. And for how long has this been the standard? I really don't know. I even tried looking up info on this and couldn't find anything super concrete. Maybe I wasn't searching the right terms, but yeah, it's been around for a good long while. I mean, software development cycle has been around probably easily since like the 80s. Like, you know, computers were becoming more and more ubiquitous by then, so things were becoming way more, you know, flow charted and stuff,
and common terms across different like similar industries, like there's like a common language and jargon.
Yeah.
Do you think this cycle is still relevant? Like we mentioned games as a live service, and from my perspective, it seems that a lot of games, particularly mobile games as a live service, a lot of things that have like battle passes type of, you know, that's an easy way to kind of paint a broad picture, right? Those games are continuing to get updates, right? Those are the post-release updates. There are things like mechanical changes, there's DLC. There are a lot of ways that a game changes after its initial release. So I'm not sure how relevant the cycle still seems to me, but I'm not actually in a studio. So from your perspective, does the cycle still make sense when you're at a larger company? Are these milestones still like really useful like within a studio?
Yes, I think the production cycle we currently have is still relevant. I kind of believe that the bigger your team gets, the more important this cycle gets and kind of adhering to it. But as a smaller development or say a hobbyist, like just a one person type deal, you could tackle it however you want, but you'll probably get different mileage out of it, like potentially burn yourself out by trying to bring something to near final only to realize like you don't really like the idea, that type of thing. So just in general, like the framework is still good. There are some steps you can probably skip, you know, depending on what your project is or what you want to do. But yeah, I don't see anyone throwing it out anytime soon.
So if you were to work with like a small team of people and you were going to be creating a game, like an indie game, you would still talk in the language of, we're going to have this projected date for alpha, beta will be here.
If I was in a small team and we were looking to launch a product by a certain date, the moment you set a deadline, we are implementing a cycle or a schedule, because otherwise it's just free form. Whatever we do, and whatever happens. But if we have a goal in mind, then we need to implement some sort of plan to reach that goal, which we just so happen to have this like very well proved out like formula that has worked for many like multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar companies.
Mm-hmm. So it serves as a common language for other people who are in the studio.
Yes.
What about early access? Is early access like gold or pre-gold, or is that what beta testing is like?
Yeah, early access is pre-gold, meaning well, I mean, you know, they can release a game in early access at more or less any stage. I mean, you know, at an alpha stage or a green light stage almost. And from there, it just like keeps getting updates until the game reaches 1.0. That is what gold is. And from there, you start to see the version numbers. Like, this is patch 1.01, 1.12, blah, blah, blah.
Okay, cool. That was kind of just like a one-off question that I should have asked earlier. But anyway, I want to push back about the, like, you know, it's still a useful cycle. I understand what you're saying, that like from the studio's perspective, it's just kind of like this, like there's this lexicon that you and other programmers or other developers have that, it's kind of easy benchmarks and like milestones that everybody can immediately think about at the same time. What about something like Cyberpunk, right? Like Cyberpunk notoriously was in terrible condition when it went gold, and they are continuing to patch it now. And I think, by now, I think a lot of people would agree that Cyberpunk just shouldn't have been released when it was released, and they were adhering to they were committed to a certain deadline that they really couldn't uphold, and the game really suffered for that, and unprecedented things happened as a result, like Sony just replacing, like refunding people who bought it or whatever, like nuts, like the fact that any first is happening because of the hype surrounding this game and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But would you say that that's just an outlier, that like gold is still a relevant standard despite the fact that day one updates can be so huge, or do you think that gold at least has like kind of fallen off the map?
I think that gold has relaxed a little bit. I don't think gold is fully useless. I think it is still a useful milestone to have, but certainly with the advent of the internet and it being more and more ubiquitous, I think whatever part of the business that sort of manages the expectations for that have loosened up a bit. It's like in some cases, like they've loosened up, but that's not to say that like now it's just like, something gets pooped out and it gets pooped out. Like it needs to still be able to fully function from start to finish and have like less than X number of like blocker, major, minor bugs in the game. So what might happen sometimes, I don't really know, is because like I don't exist in these like closed doors conversations and all that jazz. Like I could imagine maybe in some cases, like let's say for like CD Projekt Red, right? We had seen all this like media hype that was like, hey, they made The Witcher 3, and then they made The Witcher 3, and then they made The Witcher 3. Isn't that fucking awesome? Aren't they the best studio ever? Like, I could see that type of, say, clout giving someone a little more runway when it came to that. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not like, yeah, I'm not like directly accusing anyone of anything, but what I'm saying is like, there are still people having conversations, and like it's not like I'm showing my lead the milestone. It's now like some dude who's like several zeros above my pay grade is showing the build to someone else and saying like, yeah, this looks rough, but we've got the talent to fucking knock it out the park, or this, that, and the third. Like maybe that happens in some cases. I don't think that is like always the case, especially as like, sentiment from the gamers or the market, whatever, as sentiment grows more hostile because of the unstable nature of the products, that puts more kind of like pressure, I guess like internal pressure or whatever, on the people checking these like milestones and making sure shit goes through. So yeah, the milestone itself still matters. Cyberpunk is probably just a really big outlier, but as Jim Sterling likes to point out, this outlier is starting to pop up more and more, unfortunately. So yeah,
and also a highly visible one because of the levels of expectation and whatnot.
Going to the, I guess, re-referencing the Game Engines episode, like these games that usually get fucked up by that are super complex games or super massively scaled, scoped games. And I don't know if that is to tell us that maybe we're getting too big for our britches, or if we need to just put more time towards these things, to kind of manage and meet expectations. And that's just a couple of sort of various thoughts and questions I had around that, I guess.
One thing I still feel like we have yet to address is art as a changing entity, right? And I'm thinking about the development cycle of games as services, which I know I keep bringing up, but am really like concerned with how that's kind of like changing the system that is like gaming culture and whatnot. So we talked about day one updates, but we haven't like fully gotten into the cycle of games that are changing. And I think that there are archival concerns. I can't play vanilla Fortnite. I have to play the current season of Fortnite, or I'm stuck playing a mode of Knockout City that is available for this very particular week, and I don't have access to all that the game has ever been. And it kind of makes me think of like my what's the word? Like reluctance to accept art as a changing entity. Like I felt this with like The Life of Pablo by Kanye.
Mm-hmm.
How the fact that he was editing songs after the album was released, it's like, just give me one version, man.
Yeah.
Like, and I was thinking about DLC in this context too, but I think I've like kind of convinced myself that DLC probably has its own development cycle that's just kind of like smaller, but still it has to hit all the same notes.
Yeah.
But games as a service, because they're like, the idea is that they're like kind of infinite. The cycle doesn't seem like it would hold, but I
think it still holds for their updates, depending on what the game is. Like if it is Sea of Thieves, then they still have these big content updates. Like it's usually an annual one, but most recently the Pirates of the Caribbean update, like that's a lot of content. That's like some new gameplay and stuff that absolutely had to go through its like, well, one, it had to go through the searching phase of finding whatever Disney employee like hooked them up with the business talks for that license. But then also, having to like make the content, prove out the gameplay, prove out like, hey, Sea of Thieves already supports this, but also we can make some new stuff that kind of falls in line with the IP. And then, Alpha, Beta, Gold, all that. I think something similar goes for games like Fortnite and or Rocket League. Rocket League's maybe a little bit weirder, but Fortnite, with like their seasonal updates, they add in a fair amount of, at least from what I've seen, they add in a fair amount of like new gameplay tweaks and or game mechanics. So I think that type of like seasonal structure also goes through its development, that type of development cycle. However big or small it is, like they still are like Alpha, Beta, Gold it. Let's get everything working. As for the Life of Pablo thing, and I guess maybe more recently the Cats movie, how that got like day one patched in the movie theaters because something had happened with the special effects. I didn't even get a chance to see it. So that's the thing that makes me, like, you say, like, just give me one version, and I'm like, wait, no, let me see what the fuck you put out, and then let me see how you fixed it, or how you think you fixed it, because at that point, I don't know, it gets kind of like maybe death of the author-y. It's like, just like give me the thing. I want the thing. I want to know what your brain and your spirit and everything was thinking of at that moment to synthesize that. I don't want to know yet what Kanye thinks of his album and how he'd fuck around with it until I've heard the whole thing and I've made my own judgment on it. And like, all the power to the artist to like update and, fix their vision how they see fit. But for the audience, like, give them, I guess, like, for the audience from a business standpoint, if you have agreed to like put out this original piece of work or what have you, like, put out that work, and then whatever follows that work is now a different work, because Life of Pablo version 1.25 is definitely not going to sound like version 1, and maybe like version 1.25 throws me into an existential crisis, whereas version 1 like brings me like unbelievable joy. So, jumping off of Kanye albums and DLC, let's talk a bit about agile versus waterfall development. That is our skill treat for today.
Yum.
These are two different philosophies that come towards game development in the production cycle. So waterfall, named after the visual image of a waterfall, is about hitting kind of like those not necessarily the milestones, but it is structured in that milestone-esque type way. Basically from like in one direction, bottom to top or top to bottom, you'd go from like, you know, this is what we're going to do during concept. This is what we're going to do during like the alpha stretch. This is what we're going to do during the beta stretch. This is what we're going to do during the gold stretch. And that's not necessarily leaving room for flexibility or acknowledging like, hey, after building out shooting, it turns out the shooting feels really bad. Like we need to change this. Oh, well, from alpha to beta, we said we were just going to you know, focus on solely the levels at that point. We don't have time to focus on the shooting. We need to stick to the levels. That more rigid and or steep like structure is waterfall, whereas agile is kind of more, it's more meant to be like, what can you like slap onto it? In some ways it's like chasing
more
the
responsive?
fun. More responsive. Yeah. So
chasing the fun. I like that.
Yeah. So like you start with just this idea, not the whole scale idea, but just like, oh, I want to make a first person shooter with a grapple hook. And then you prototype it out, you play it, and you're like, okay, how does this feel? Let me evaluate it. Like, how does this feel? You know, like, where's it going bad? Where can I like lean into it to make it good? And then you take your next step and you like flesh out your idea from there, and you keep going and you keep going. And that's like, that's more agile development. And the idea is that you should be able to apply like either philosophy to the game development cycle, but more likely than not, using a majority of agile practices while keeping some sensibilities of the waterfall structure is what makes the best product.
Is it the case that a studio will determine prior to like the main production cycle
whether they're doing agile or waterfall?
Or like what the primary focus will be? Yeah.
No, not really. Like, yes and no. It's more so like, how does the studio operate? Because the studio isn't changing whether it does agile versus waterfall.
Okay, gotcha,
you know what I mean?
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's like we as a studio, we as a studio, we practice agile. We as a studio, we practice waterfall, and it's going to take like a year of training to break our mind from that process and mentality and whatever.
Yeah, it reminds me of like top-down and bottom-up processing in cognitive psychology, which, you know, refers to the area of the brain, you know, like the locus of like, and with the anatomy of the brain, you know, I mean, obviously humans are sapient creatures, blah, 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 right? So the most recently evolved parts of our brains are the ones that deal with the most complex cognitive processes, right? So they're not, the prefrontal cortex is like deals with problem solving and rationality and theorizing and abstract thinking, whereas the lower parts of the brain would deal more with like breathing or involuntary activity, right? So all this to say, there's also, you know, when in terms of like learning, right? If you, let's say you hear a word, right? If you hear that word and you're leading with the sensation, right? Like if it is going into your ear and you're not like familiar with that word, that may be a bottom up kind of approach where where like you're hearing the word and you're trying to make sense of it, primarily beginning with the way that it sounds. If instead it, you know, you're expecting to fill in the sentence yourself, you may be leading with rationality or predictive thinking rather than like the actual word. This happens when you mishear a word in a song and like your brain kind of just fills in what that word of the song is, and it may be something that also makes sense in the context, but isn't actually the right term, right? Yeah, anyway, so the top-down and bottom-up processing that you're talking about with development are also used on an individual level. I just kind of like that parallel of like there being the more agile, responsive, you know, bottom-up type of approach that's responding more directly to the stimulus versus the more like task and process oriented and like, you know,
very structured, rigid, waterfall approach. Yeah, man. Hopefully you can use agile and or waterfall in your side project.
Definitely some agiles. Thank you for listening to Deep in the Deep Head. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and share us with your friends.
For updates and discussion, follow us on Reddit at r/deepinthedpad, Facebook at deepdpad, and subscribe to Deep in the D-Pad on YouTube. Don't forget to hit the bell.
And if you want to ask us questions or you had a chance to share your own D-Pad delight on the show, email us at askdeepinthedpad@gmail.com. Be sure to put question or delight in the subject line.
Big thanks to 8-Bit Jazz and Kevin MacLeod for supplying the music for the show.